Thank you, Ranveer. Thank you to the Bangalore International Center and the Architecture Foundation. And it's really wonderful to be here to see so many old friends, a real delight to be doing something in Bangalore and at the Bangalore International Center, for the first time. So today, what I'm going to do, I was just wondering, can you actually put the light on the audience slightly up? I'm like feeling this is, okay, that's good. As long as, yeah, that's good. Thank you. So, what I'm going to do today, I'm going to just jump right into it, is to really share with you about 30 years as a trajectory of doing research. And I've quite consciously called this research as practice. It's really a reflection. This is the second time I'm attempting a lecture like this. I did one with Prakriti Foundation just a few weeks ago, a month or two maybe. And I'm trying to use this as a way of even reflecting on it. A lot of the research and writing one was doing was it wasn't conscious of trying to accumulate it as a body of practice. One was working with Sharda Dwivedi in Mumbai to support advocacy. Once I started teaching in the academy, began to look at other issues. And now I'm sort of at a point where I feel that for us as a profession, a community, I think it's important to begin to start addressing questions of how we can theorize, reflect, and begin to take the practice of research, in a sense, or research as practice, much more seriously. So I think for me, for complex projects, which is what one got involved with in the city of Mumbai, for advocacy, whether it was urban conservation, etc., and projects that go into the public realm, at the scale of the cities, actors actually become even more clearly differentiated. And hence the building of constituencies and the way politicians build constituencies becomes really critical to engage different stakeholders. And I think here, books, research, I think for us as a profession to have a position on some of these questions which are articulated, I think it's critical for us to have agency. And otherwise, if we don't have that agency, I think it frustrates us in terms of our influence on the built environment. So I'm going to reflect on this. I'm going to show you several pieces of research. Each of these pieces of research, honestly, even if I may say it, are a lecture in themselves. But I'll just touch upon what were the couple of important things. And I think the idea of the panel discussion with Bijoy and with Sumitro is then maybe extract from that things that they would think might be of interest for an audience like this. So in this condition of flux, which is what I believe we are all experiencing in really, really acute ways, I think to be able to engage in different ways within the practice of architecture and even construct architecture for that practice in a sense becomes very critical, because we are living in particularly transitional times today. And I think architecture hasn't been sufficiently responsive to this condition. Human settlements have historically aspired and have been obsessed with making architecture permanent. Stability has been our obsession, rightly so perhaps, through imagining absolute solutions. And I think one of the implicit messages in this lecture is, can we think in transitionary terms? And that's why the architectures of transitions is a provocation, because thinking of transitionary solutions is quite different, because the provocation is, are we making permanent solutions for what might be temporary problems, right? In a state of flux that becomes a really critical question for architects. And I don't think we are equipped in the way we formulate our positions that we look at it in this kind of sort of way. And that's what happens when flux hits the ground. You begin a kind of intersection between natural systems, built environment, what we call the formal and the informal city, big pieces of infrastructure, etc. How does this all get resolved, right? That becomes the question. And then I think the issue of context is very critical, because as architects and designers, the idea of context is something we've traditionally understood as the broader physical environment of a given site, the comprehension of which is extended through wider parameters such as climate, culture, some of us are more ambitious and we look at embedded histories. But is this reading potent and dynamic enough for designers to understand the world in which we intervene? If not, how does an architect construct the appropriate narratives to the built environment at large, or of the built environment at large? And I think here the notion of nestling the context in its context can potentially create a more nuanced and productive reading of our sites of intervention. So that means you construct meta-narratives, clarifying the context in which the context that you're looking at, of the context of our operation sits as architects then. And it is in this space where the intersection happens between the physical, more tangible, slightly intangible context, if we are more ambitious, sits within a larger context. And that larger context extends all the way, perhaps, to the planet. From these contexts, you can look at, issues of neoliberalism, issues of the urbanization of poverty, the remaking of political identities. You can look at new claims on citizenship, all the stuff that actually hovers around us, but we don't find a way to nestle the immediate context that we are operating on within this sort of broader context. So this notion of the context, I think is an interesting provocation that we should challenge ourselves to look at. Because this then squarely leads us to narratives of state reconstruction, under neoliberalism, the notion of simultaneous transitions in cities. I have a colleague called Eve Blau who looks at East Europe, and it resonates deeply for me in South Asia. And she argues that, societies, when they make a transition, you transition out of something into something, but that happens simultaneously. So when in East Europe they were transitioning out of communism into capitalism, her argument is that those are not clean transitions. These transitions go on for decades and even a generation. So we, for decades, transition out of something while we are simultaneously transitioning into something. And look at the built environment around us, that's what it's emblematic of. That is a simultaneous transition. And so therefore, if you begin to understand it in those terms, perhaps we are better equipped, in a sense, to intervene. And of course, extending from this discourse are questions pertaining to the role of the state and the agency of planning and design relative to new forms of democracy developing around the world, NGOs, civil society, and rapidly changing modes of patronage. Each have, they have renewed roles in the making of the built environment. So what I'm going to do is first just go through a few issues that have actually now in retrospect, and often when one is operating, you work intuitively, but now in retrospect, I'm beginning to sort of organize in a way that might be useful, perhaps for another generation. And so one of the questions is, we are actually yet founded on theory that came out of the industrializing world in the West in the last century. We are yet referring to those theories. But if you look at that circle, as you say, as it says, there are more people that live inside the circle than outside the circle. So therefore, the questions of density, the transitions between urban, rural, it's completely different. What is the theory that we could look at in order to inform ourselves of how to operate that? That circle needs its own theory, in a sense, right? This is a wonderful diagram that a colleague of mine, Joan Busquets, who's a very well-known urban designer in Barcelona, made, where he said, a city is about urbanization, plot division, and buildings, right? In the traditional city, urbanization happened first. The monarch decided they're going to settle a city. The plot divisions was attributed to his powers, and then buildings happened. In the garden city development, urbanization and plot division actually collapsed. So the developer made that, and then you built your own house. In the housing estates that we see all over our country and South Asia, it actually collapses as one entity, which is a developer turnkey gives you the building, the plot, the housing, the infrastructure, the whole process, right? In informal housing, which is 70% of many cities, it's the reverse. Building happens first, then it's legitimized through legitimizing ownership of the plots, and then infrastructure, et cetera, might go there. It's completely opposite. How do you theorize that in terms of intervention? And I don't think the dichotomy, the binary of the formal and the informal city is useful at all. Binaries are wonderful ways to organize the world, to understand it, but for designers, I think our role is to dissolve those binaries into a third space, into solutions that resolve those contestations, not highlight it. So when we look at the theories on the informal city, I find it frustrating and not helpful and not inspiring. And settlements, we've forgotten, the holy trinity for settlements is dwelling, I'm not calling it housing, livelihoods, and mobility. Elasticity of that mobility, amenities get supported by that. This has completely fallen apart in our cities. The shop house was perfect because mobility was a flight of staircase that you went down, worked in the morning, went up. We have made mobility elastic. So cities that have good public transportation, you yet have that relationship. But then when that breaks down and the relationship between dwelling, livelihoods, and that mobility as an equation breaks, you get the chaos that we all experience. These are just fundamental things that I think it's worth remembering and have inspired me in my research to find ways to understand this better. And then, of course, you look at scale, and you can organize the world around you in many of these scales. But then the important thing is, how do you nestle these scales? How do you begin to create the intersectionality? We work at one scale or the other, but how, in the way that design is reiterative, right? You look at the elevation, you zoom down to the building mullion, you zoom back and you've changed your elevation. We should be able to do that with the context too. That is to nestle these scales. And then, of course, this notion of designing transitions and not absolute solutions. Are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? The design of transitions is completely different. I mean, a simple example is in India's energy policy, right? We made the transition to renewables through nuclear when Manmohan Singh and Bush signed that famous treaty. Now you might get stuck in nuclear, but you're going in a completely different direction to arrive at what seems in close proximity, but our whole economy would collapse if we suddenly went to renewables. So design of transitions in the built environment, I think, is something we need to pay more attention to as professional architects. And then lastly, what is this idea of modes of engagement? We call it models of practice, but I'd say modes of engagement. How do we engage? I think research, theory, pedagogy is one way, advocacy, practice. Can these all collapse together? Or do we create compartments? And I think maybe the compartments aren't so productive. And then theory. What itself is theory? Theory is, I think, reflecting on what one sees on the ground. And by reflecting, you create a framework so that you can pick up and understand other problems better. So theory today should be coming out of China, Africa, India, where there's action on the ground, and yet we are referring to theory that came out of the industrializing West in the last century. But what does that theory even mean? So disciplines, my discipline is urban design, or at least I teach that, and that's my role in the university. I don't even call urban design a discipline. I think it's a practice. It doesn't have a robust framework, a theoretical framework that would make it a discipline where we have enough information by which we can inform the decisions we make in the builder. So urban design for me is a practice. It's a bridge practice between the abstraction of planning and the site specificity of architecture. Planning is a discipline. It has a whole gamut of theory that informs it. And so for urban design, which is, I think, the closest bridge to architecture, how do we create these theoretical frameworks? What I'm very excited about is this notion, and it's not my invention, of propositional research, which is about where their primary focus is on formulating and exploring propositions, which are statements that suggest a potential relationship between concepts, often used in fields where direct empirical testing might be different. In our case, that's true, serving as a starting point for further investigation and theory development. Essentially, it involves exploring the theoretical connections between ideas rather than immediately testing specific hypotheses with concrete ideas, right? So you use proxies, you use intuition through proxies. Of course, intuition by itself might be very vague, but there are enough proxies you can use which can help make these connections. It's asking questions which then actually are propositional. And the idea of propositional research, which is a field in itself, I think resonates very deeply with what we could potentially look at, And so, for example, the key points about propositional research is it has a conceptual focus, it's exploratory in nature, and that is its strength. It becomes the basis for theory building. It's not theory in itself, and it's not directly often testable. You need other forms, in a sense, to test it. So what I'm going to now share with you, this was an introduction of the kind of frameworks that I have used in the way of informing this. Again, all retrospectively culled, because while you do this sort of intuitively using proxies. And here I'm going to show you some research within the bracket I would call urbanism. The second would be on a couple of conservation things, because that has been a lot of my work, and then on architecture. I'll go through this as quickly as I can. It's a long lecture. But I will also not go into much detail, and I would leave it to our panelists to help us extract or extend what you think or what they might think would resonate with you and Bangalore, etc. One of my starting books was this, which was called Everyday Urbanism, which was a debate between Margaret Crawford, who wrote a book by that name, and Michael Speaks, who's the dean at Syracuse. And I put that together as a transcription, and I was amused by the fact that what they were describing in little bits of California where the weather is good and in Texas was what our cities were all about. And that inspired me to write an essay which was called The Kinetic City, which was about blurring the binary between the formal and informal, but looking at the kinetic as a way of describing the city itself, which for me was much more inspirational as a category than the informal city, because I believe this sort of form of leveraging the ephemeral is actually cultural, and the rich and the poor use it. It's not only the city of the poor, as the images might sort of suggest. It's what the Indian scholar Ravi Sundaram refers to as a pirate modernity that slips under the laws of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. Here, architecture is not even the single spectacle of the city, and these binaries, in a sense, dissolve. I would argue that a lot of people living in what looks like the informal city, that's an aesthetic bias we have, work in the formal economy. And a lot of people who live in what looks like the formal city actually are employed in the informal economy, right? So what architecture looks like and what it means often doesn't map. And therefore, there's this slippage. How do you sort of unpack that, right? And it is a city which is about elasticity, it's about incrementalism, it's about appropriation, and it's about soft thresholds, where the blur and the transgressions between different parts of societies and income groups occur very easily. So we kind of map this. This is called the 5 stages of squatting. This is the logic by which the city is sort of made and normalized. In a sense, we looked at other uses of public space, as Ashish Nandi has described this wonderful Indian game that the British invented called cricket. And these maidans in the evening become venues for wedding. The cricket pitch no one touches because that's sacred space. The wedding wraps around it. The samosas go both to the club members as well as to the wedding. In the morning, it goes back to normalcy and the cricketers take it over, right? So we looked at this through a taxonomy of transaction, which is markets, operations, the dabbawalas, where formal infrastructures kind of collapse with informal operations. We looked at instability, how public spaces are made and remade for festivals. We looked at habitation, housing. We looked at what were the spectacles of the city. And so this is the book that sort of documents all of this to come up with this sort of idea. And here what it does is it challenges the idea of the city as a static and a stable entity. Basically, what one is challenging is that the idea that architecture cannot be the single instrument by which we imagine the city, which is what we assume as professionals, architects, urban designers, that you can actually create a fantastic urban form and the city will thrive. But this is a very deep negotiation between the two. And it is not architecture here. I call these the landscapes of impatient capital. Capital is intrinsically impatient. The terrains that make the friction for capital to land and to realize its value are minimized. You get the landscapes like Dubai. These are all largely autocracies, right? But in the kinetic city, there are other spectacles. And the Ganesh festival, for example, is one example where immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city. And as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, when the spectacle comes to a close, there are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the memory of the city itself is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain memory and are static entities. The kinetic city obviously cannot be seen as a design tool. Rather, it's a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, that are flexible, that are robust, and ambiguous enough to allow the kinetic quality of the city to flourish, where the human being is present in the imagination of the city, where the city is also imagined through how people might associate to space, not only using architecture as the single instrument. So this then, the idea of the kinetic was taken to ephemeral, and the idea of city was taken to urbanism. And I sort of worked on this project, which was mapping the Kumbh Mela, which is going to happen after these 12 years again soon. It was a university-wide project, and we went out there to study what, the Kumbh Mela had not been mapped earlier as a city, never been mapped. It had always been mapped as a spectacle of sadhus and people running into the water. So we went with a mission, 40 people in this team across the university, to map and understand it as an ephemeral megacity and what that might mean and how one could actually instrumentalize that. And so these are just, this was for an installation, so I'll just show you a bit of it. This was from 12 years ago. Maybe it's got more organized now. This is people waiting at the Sangam. And so it is a very complex construct when you start seeing it through the lens of urbanism as a city that is designed, made, and it's not a pop-up city. It's very intentional. It has all the attributes of a regular city, all forms of infrastructure, governance, hospitals, clinics, and this is what the different schools at the university really began to document. And that's what it sort of looks like in the ground. It has order, it's on a grid. It was a really interdisciplinary project because no one discipline could even claim an understanding of it. And therefore, it really became an incredible interdisciplinary project where, as you know, from these monsoon-fed rivers, when the water sort of dries up and the banks emerge, within 6 weeks, a whole city for 5 to 7 million people emerges there. And then, of course, 100 million people visit it on the 5 sacred days. And that's an image we took when we went to recce it in October, just after the monsoons had stopped. And from the same spot, we took an image where 3 months later, the whole city had emerged on the 14th of January was when that image was taken. It employs a grid. There's a logic to it. So even if the river begins to sway, if there's an unseasonal rain, etc., the robustness of it stays. In the city, every road goes across the grid as a pontoon bridge. So it's incredibly robust. It's not like Manhattan or other cities where you have 2 bridges and there's a jam up. Here, every road just extends automatically through. So it's an incredibly robust sort of formation. And like I said, I can't get into the details, but a couple of things that for me were huge learnings. One was the entire city is made from this kit of parts. Everything that you see above the ground, of course, there's infrastructure, there's pipes, there's electricity, but everything above the ground is made out of these 5 materials: 8-foot tall bamboo, rope or string or wire, nails or screw, and a skinning material. Could be corrugated metal, could be plastic, or could be textile. But that's how it can be constructed so quickly and disassembled so quickly. There's a whole logic to it. But it takes on amazing forms. It's all the same 5 materials, and you have large temples that can accommodate 1,000 people, and you have tents where a family or a couple can kind of live. So it's quite expansive in the way it gets deployed. The other thing that was very interesting was the governance on a temporal scale. So what you see in red is the politicians, the chief minister calling the shots a year before the Kumbh Mela. What you see in yellow is the bureaucrats taking over after 3 or 4 months. And what you see in blue is a complete flip in the hierarchy where the Kumbh Mela Adhikari has all the power to go outside the circle, to do whatever they need. He's the most powerful guy, and he has to only report to 1 or 2 people on the top. So decisions can be made very quickly. In our cities, actually, more than the building, the governance mechanisms are fossils because they come from like long ago, and they get perpetuated. And therefore, we are not very nimble in the way we can react to things. So to understand this governance system on a kind of temporal scale was a revelation which was, very, very educative for all of us. So these were the kinds of things we were looking at. I'm happy to elaborate more. If you look at, this is the last day when they offer a thanks to the mother goddess, and in 2 weeks the city disappears. What are left are these mats out of thatch, which the river just sort of swallows when it's done. It leaves no memory, and this entire megacity of 7 million people sort of goes. Now, this is a formal, intentional, deliberate operation. It was the cleanest Indian city I've ever lived in. It was immaculate in terms of the maintenance. They have 10,000 sweepers who are employed, the systems, the electricity, the water, the toilets. It was amazing. There are many questions about environmental pressures because of pollution, and there are people working on that. In fact, Diana Eck from our team, who is a professor of divinity, her whole mission at this was actually working with an akhada on how one could mitigate some of these ecological questions, environmental questions. And I know this time there are more people. I think the Center for Policy Research reached out recently that they want to address these environmental questions looking at this particular Mela. So that is coming into consciousness. In any case, we extended this into, because the criticism was, okay, you've studied Hindu festival, what does it mean? How is it relevant? So we extended this research to what we called ephemeral urbanism more broadly, and we looked at the idea of how this sort of ephemerality, temporality also extends actually to refugee camps. I would argue the squatter settlements we see in all our cities is part of this, right? Because some of them have become the new normal, the temporary has become the new permanent, but yet it's worth understanding its logic and what it means. And so we began to look at a number of other cases around the world within the rubric of the contemporary landscapes that were sort of ephemeral. And of course, the Kumbh Mela was one of the biggest, in terms of human gathering. But there are also many other forms of settlements across North America. These are the snowbirds at Quartzside who go there during the winter months. These are large settlements that they go below our radar for the profession because they're not permanent buildings. They're not settlements that even suggest a form of permanence. In any case, what we did was sorry, I'll just go back to it just to give you some images, which, sorry, I should have let that go. Yeah. So that's, of course, the Kumbh Mela, but this was the kind of mapping we did. We found hundreds of cases around the world where either for religion or for refuge or for other such functions, there were aggregations of millions of people who would settle, sometimes temporarily on a seasonal cycle. And then we began to create a taxonomy. So it was the ephemeral landscapes of religion. That's a clear taxonomy. Then there was, and then there are many, many cases that you can look at around the world where you have a celebration, which are festivals, that occur all over the world. Sometimes they even go for 4 or 5 days. Woodstock was a version of a chaotic one. Burning Man is an incredible. You have transactions, which are markets around the world that also work on this kind of temporal rhythm. And these are, there's a whole book that came out recently just looking at temporary markets. There's extraction, where the life cycle, the expiration date is much longer. Copper lasts for 50 years, but a whole town is removed after the quarry or the mine is gone. So that's a different life cycle. And really, there's military. They're also, and military also 20 years, 25 years, these become entire settlements in many places. Of course, there's refuge, which is refugee camps. That's part of the taxonomy, etc. So we began to create this sort of taxonomy because, again, you can't make a rubric like ephemeral urbanism and then kind of construct a theory around that, because within this category, there are many nuances, right? Because when you have transaction, the temporality is much tighter. There's a reason. The understanding and the rules are very clear. You're transacting. When you have military, it's a whole draconic kind of operation. When you have extraction, the life cycles are much longer. When you have religion, there's usually a single purpose. That's where the Kumbh Mela works. So in strife, and you have other forms of conflicts, etc. So you have to look at each of these on their own terms. And there's a whole book that we produced and an exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which actually proposed this question, does permanence matter, as a provocation to an architectural forum where permanence is an obsession. And these are just images from that. And this is the book that came out of it, which maps all this research and extends it. And more recently, When I say criticism, it's productive criticism, I got was, I mean, what does this have to do with architecture and how can it inform architecture? So very recently, the October issue with Naman Ahuja of Marg magazine, I did on tents. And it's a whole issue on tents, where we have looked at tents historically and in the contemporary, and I've sort of proposed here that actually the tent is the most enduring image or symbol of human settlement. And it should be looked at seriously because they are on the planet, I would say, and this is thumb rule, back of envelope calculations, more than 300, 400 million people on this planet live in tents yet. I would imagine that many of the tents are the squatter settlements we look at. That's one form of it. This is an incredible image from Bangladesh. This is a market in Dhaka, which you see. It's like a tapestry, but these are all tents, and it's one of the largest markets in the country, and quite beautiful. So this whole issue is dedicated to the idea of tents, which are ephemeral and enduring. The Mughals actually used tented cities as models for cities before they settled. In fact, the word Urdu means camp. That's the meaning of the word Urdu, and that's the language that was attributed, that came from the synthesis of Persian and Sanskrit, perhaps, from these camps. And so Urdu means camp. And so we looked at Bedouin camps, the logic by which they mitigated the impacts of weather, sandstorms, etc. Very deep sort of, understanding of the landscape by which they kind of responded it to. We also had scholars write about historic tents, about textiles, and how textiles were used in these tents as a way of not only emperors asserting their power, but also as a way of looking and showing off products that would be then exported. And they were very beautiful Mughal tents. This is a famous red velvet tent. We also looked at Fry Otto's tents, which were the new technologies of tents. We also looked at how tents complement buildings, and you don't have to build a full solid structure, but you could actually have attachments which begin to create another logic. And this is an image from Dubai, where for weddings and for ceremonies, they use tents even in that context, right? So within that contextual understanding. Now that then extended further to what I call, and now I'm moving into urbanism. I looked at, this is the last bit of urbanism. So what is urban, even if you zoom out now, talking about nestling scale? So if you go from a tent to the urban, what does it begin to mean? And this is where I talked about proxies, because looking at this, one was very uncomfortable with the representation of what the urban landscape in India was by how the government shows you big and small dots, which are very contained. And if you look at this as a proxy, you see another form of urbanization, continuous urbanization. There's no border between Pakistan, even when you look at Lahore and Delhi. And so therefore, what does this mean? And we look at, these are some of the metrics we look at. And in India, there are three criteria for something being defined as city or urban. One criteria is that it has to have a population of more than 5,000 people. It has to have a density of 400 people per square kilometer. And one very bizarre, got complicated historic reasons, is over 75% of the male population is in non-agricultural employment, which doesn't actually happen in India. As a result of these three criteria collapsing, this is what urban India looks like. This is how we make our investments for infrastructure, where airports go, where highways go, what we connect, etc. So what we did was we took, and this was work with Saurav Bishwas, who was an ex-student. We've been working on it for now almost a decade. And we are lucky that this census didn't happen because our work would be redundant. But because the census has been delayed, we are trying to finish this. And I think the new census will only reinforce this idea. So we took each of the criteria, like density, 5,000 people, and said, let's make maps for each of the criteria and see what urban means. So if you take the criteria, 5,000 people per settlement as a baseline, that's what urban India looks like. Urban India looks, scattered like what you see. And of course, we all know Kerala has that continuous density, right, of settlements. If you take the criteria of 400 people per square kilometer, which is a density criteria, the Indo-Gangetic Plain is the world's biggest megacity because it's got, and the densities go even higher. But all the way from Delhi and even touching Kashmir to Calcutta is a megacity, which is the world's biggest megacity because that's where the density is. Then if you took the criteria of 75% of the male population, the whole megacity disappears, because everyone in the Gangetic Plain is doing agriculture and working half the time in a city on other urban jobs. And so that criteria falls apart completely. So what is urban India for us in terms of that imaginary becomes a critical question. And therefore then when you look at what we call, because using the word reverse migration, which is the word that was used officially, is very bizarre, because internal migration is quite different from what this implies. And this is already implying an inside-outside kind of politically. And the people who walk back, and of course 11 million people was the statistics we heard. IIM Ahmedabad did a study and they said it was definitely over 30 million people who walked back, etc. They all walk back to those areas where that large megacity exists, where people do these dual jobs, right? So then you begin to understand through that mapping a whole lot. And the conclusion we are coming to, I mean, again, there are many conclusions here, is that actually in India, there are about 13,500, I would say now might have gone up to 15,000 settlements that have all the attributes of being urban, but because they don't meet one of the criteria, they are yet classified as rural, which means they don't have municipalities, they don't have infrastructure, they are a time bomb for public health in terms of sanitation, because those investments don't exist. So what we are trying to do here is bring attention. I mean, there are places that are 150,000 people that are yet villages, and they're run by a panchayat. Maybe it's a better thing, but they don't have the funding and the support to actually support what you need to make it livable. So this is a book which we hope will be out in a few months. It's called Becoming Urban, as a process, because we are, this whole idea, we are now 40% urban, 50% urban. It again cannot. It is this idea of simultaneity. We are going to keep becoming urban, and it'll take different forms. Now, the important thing here is it has huge, huge implications for us as architects, which we don't sort of actually pay attention to. And I think the design implications we should be paying huge attention to are, one is housing. It actually forces you to rethink housing. The pandemic, the true pandemic in the housing debate is that we look at the metric of 1 BHK, 2 BHK. We assume a nuclear family. And all the metrics in terms of the imaginaries that are created for housing is based on that assumption. Whereas actually what we need is YMCA type dharamchalas, which have good amenities so that people in this flux can actually be housed. Most people living in what we call the informal settlement are actually sometimes space sharing on that seasonal rhythm. So we need to rethink the typology of housing. We need to think of spaces of transaction which are different. And this is where it links to the research on ephemeral urbanism. As we do this research, we realize there's a lot we can learn from there. We might have to thicken borders between zones, between what are urban and rural. So in fact, when we look at even Mumbai, what is the MMRDA boundary? If you look at a satellite image, that boundary is dissipated long ago. The city extends way beyond. It's true for Bangalore. It's true for many others. This also has a huge implication on the way you understand where poverty resides. But the biggest implication is on sanitation, because what we talk about open defecation maps exactly with where we are seeing these fluxes in terms of where the transitioning settlements are, which don't have the mapping. And we look at absolute solutions. For me, the idea of having a toilet put outside somebody's house is an absolute solution. The transition would mean actually thinking about community toilets more seriously and thinking about their design more seriously. You cannot, in a squatter settlement, in a slum, in an informal, you're looking at legitimizing land. There's so many complexities. There's no way you can get individual toilets. In Mumbai, the toilets, the community toilets generate 392 crores per annum. So that's more than 1 crore per day is being spent by the poorest of the poor in the city to pay to use a toilet. It's just mind-boggling that we haven't been able to, as a profession, imagine a better solution. So this became a studio which I've called Sanitation as Infrastructure. And with students, we did propositions, we did research. So this is one of the books that one has produced. We looked at sanitation as an ecology, which is much more complex, which has equations of water. I mean, there are just many things. You can't look at it just as toilets, because if you take it away from that border ecology, you can't define the toilet. And through the Architecture Foundation, this is a book that's been produced, which is, we've called it a sanitation hub, which might also have public health facilities, laundromats, all of that. But what we did as an endeavor, raising funds privately, was to create a catalog of how in different situations in the country, what is urban, what is a transitioning settlement, what is an inner city, slum, etc. How do you imagine this sanitation hub? And we studied actually the texture and material of these places and came up with design propositions which would use what were the local skills and materials to create these sanitation hubs. We also included within this a tender document with BOQs and everything, so any NGO can take it and actually begin to run with it as a first step and contextualize it. So it gives you a method to contextualize something for a very particular locality. And so therefore, then that takes me to this notion of advocacy. What I've talked to you about right now is theory, practice. This last bit was pedagogy because that's part of my teaching. But advocacy, and I go back now to Mumbai, the many books I did with Sharda Dwivedi, my friend Gunwanti is here, who was very much part of this through as a journalist supporting these efforts. But these, I call them instruments of advocacy. Some of them you could say edge on scholarly work, but they were really instruments of advocacy. Often what happens is, as architects, we want to do advocacy, we want to make the instruments of advocacy, we want to do everything, then we sit on our research because we don't want to share it. But I think we are best equipped to make instruments of advocacy, which people who have the wherewithal to do advocacy can do, right? Those partnerships are very clear, and we should see that role very clearly, where we make these imaginaries that other people can rally around and actually take to another level. So we get ambitious often that we get so married to our research, and so therefore one always saw these as instruments of advocacy that went out to the world, created friendships, but also impacted things in other ways. And I think many of the things that happened in Mumbai with the Bombay Environmental Action Group, Sham Chenani, many other advocates, came out of this approach. I can see it more clearly now, we were doing it more intuitively, is to create these instruments for advocacy. So the heritage regulation, which was the first in the country, the demarcation of the precincts in the fort area, and the complexity, the question we should ask is, and for Bangalore it's as relevant, is the narratives that we use in a post-colonial condition is quite different when we borrow our narratives from the British and English heritage. Because in a post-colonial situation, the custodians of that heritage are us. The creators were, in this case, the British. Why are we using the narratives of the creators if we as custodians have to find other ways to preserve this? And so the work that we did in defining the different precincts, the Kala Ghoda area, the banking district, many of these things came out of that question. What are the contemporary engines and what are the new narratives? It makes the architect's task hard because you have to then balance the illusion of the architecture, which is preserve the buildings, which is what we are committed to, but you're also inventing new uses. And that is a tough balance versus just getting nostalgic about what those narratives should be and trying to, and you can't carry communities like that. And so the Kala Ghoda festival, the improvements that happened in the Kala Ghoda area, which were all meant to conserve the building, the Elphinstone College, which was one of the first grade 1 buildings that got conserved through this effort, but it was also about making new interventions, creating new meaning within historic buildings and precincts, and extending that through, with Sharda Dwivedi did we have walking tours where you get publicity, where you get people engaged in looking at these buildings and becoming experts about why and articulating that they should conserve them. We did a conference which reflected on what the legislation meant. So these are all instruments of advocacy. And I think it's contingent on the profession to take that onus on. Otherwise, we take our research, I'm sorry I keep saying that, and we sit on it. And I know many people in the profession who do that. It's not generous, it doesn't help, it has to go out into the public realm. And if you imagine them as instruments of advocacy, I think they have agency. And that agency is what we desperately need as a profession. I'm going to share with you one more conservation project, and that is the Taj Mahal. We were very fortunate to be asked by the Tata Group of companies and the ASI in the early years, like Humayun's tomb happened with the Aga Khan Trust, and that was very successful. This was much more complicated, but this was preceded that in a sense. And we were asked to prepare a management plan for the Taj Mahal. And what we did was we, set up a group. We got experts from around the world. That's Bernard Fielden. He chaired our committee. We did numerous workshops to ask, what are we conserving in the Taj? What is important? How do you manage the site? And what was very interesting was finally we did nothing with the Taj, but everything around the Taj. And that was really a fantastic learning experience. And I'll just share this with you. It might be of interest. So we began to make identify, besides the Taj, there are numerous buildings there that people don't even know about, that you're not even allowed to go into. Like, so for example, this is the Saheli Burj, these are buildings which are for the lesser queens, and they are like models of the, models of the, these are these are the tomb keepers' houses. What you see here are, when you see a little dome there, those are models of the entire Taj. They are a smaller version of the Taj complex, which were for the two lesser known queens. And then we began to sort of create, again, a taxonomy of what were the components that made the Taj. We also extended it to the gardens, because the gardens were a very important part of the Taj. And so the site management plan got much more nuanced. And I think what the discoveries were, and this is, of course, we had Ebba Koch, who is, the ultimate authority. We had the Getty Foundation, World Monument Fund. So we had the best experts. Bernard Fielden chaired it, and many things came out of it. So the Taj, where you go in, you look at the Taj, it's a one-liner, you take a photograph and you go home. But if you look at it, these are the models of the Taj, which are for the lesser-known queens. These are elevated gardens. These are for the tomb keepers who would come and clean the garden, right? These were hexagons where the workers lived. A Taj Ganj, it's called. Now it's a market. That's the Taj. This is Mehtab Bagh, which the person who was really responsible for bringing this to attention was Elizabeth Moynihan, Pat Moynihan's wife, and she got interested in it and got this excavated. That's the Mehtab Bagh. The myth we grew up with was the Black Taj was there. Completely false, right? The river was the front. So the emperor entered the Taj from the river. The emperor never came through the garden. And so this was the reflective pond. Emperor sat there on a moonlight night. He saw the reflection of the Taj. That's why it was called Mehtab Bagh. And there were poetry that was invented around this murky water and the black kind of reflection of the Taj. Percy Brown and English scholars made a black Taj. They made a drawing of the black Taj, and they perpetuated a whole theory around it, which was completely, completely false. And it's so much more poetic when you see it in these terms. So those were interesting excavations. So this is an invention of the British. This is completely fake. This has become authentic, right? Curzon made this garden. This was an orchard. It was a forest. Everything was like that. You never saw the base of the Taj. That's why people who go to the Taj, I'm sure many of you have gone, to climb out to the base of the Taj is very uncomfortable with that steep stair. No one was supposed to go from there. You saw this as a floating monument in the Paradise Garden. So the whole thing was a garden with fruit trees and flowers and all of that. The emperor came from the river, which was a wonderful river, and visited the tomb. And so this is a myth. Now we are preserving this. That pathway that you see, and this was done because the Agra Regiment Band wanted to play every evening for the Mem Sahib and the children, so they could picnic and listen to the band. So they cut all the trees to do that. Now, that's what it looked like. This was when it was just discovered. It's in a very shabby state, but it was orchards. That elevated walkway was 6 feet above the ground. The only place you see that relationship is in the tomb of Sikandar, Akbar's tomb, where you see the elevation of the walkway. Because the emperor was plucking fruits at his nose level, smelling them before he plucked them. They were in Paradise Garden. That was the paradigm of this whole project, which was completely ruined and river. Now that's what we are conserving. It's a bit bizarre. And so miniature paintings capture that. And so we did this book. I did this with Amitabh Beg, which captures what we call the multiple narratives. Because there's so many stories told about the Taj which don't surface. Ebba Koch, there are many other scholars who've written fantastic academic and scholarly work, but we tried to tell these stories in a simple way so we could create a constituency around conserving it. And as part of our project, we did exhibitions, we did all sorts of things, but the government, they just put a blank on it because this was opening up a Pandora's box for them, and I can say that very candidly. But I was intrigued after we finished all this. We finished our assignment, we submitted the report. This was a map I saw there. It's called the Jaipur map. It was drawn maybe 30 years after the Taj was built. Taj was finished in 1634, etc. And this is a very interesting map. It shows the Taj. And what it shows is the Taj is extended out of the river, right? Because this was the front of the Taj. That is proof that it wasn't reflected in the other way. And what you see here are pleasure gardens. What the emperor essentially did was he upended the elite. Agra was one of the most beautiful snow-fed rivers, bubbling. Miniature paintings show you that, right? So the elite wanted pleasure gardens along the Taj, and they all got land from the emperor to have pleasure gardens. That's why if you go to Itmadullah's tomb, there are wine glasses and flowers. There are no flowers drooping in mourning. These were, well, we can call them party plots, right? They would hang out there and really have fun. Now, when the elites began to pass and generation pass, the young found a loophole in the law, and they said that they would, our father liked this so much and he was so attached to the land, we want to bury him there. And then the emperor would grant the family the land. And that was a loophole they found in the Mughal law. And so what was a landscape of pleasure gardens over one generation became a funerary site, and you had tombs all along it, right? And so it became so the Taj Mahal started with the emperor wanting the biggest pleasure garden, and he did it as a last garden on that whole river. And this had about 40 such pleasure gardens. And that's a map that shows you all the pleasure gardens that you see. This is the Taj here, that's the Agra fort, and the pleasure gardens are all along this. And that would change your whole understanding of Agra. And so we documented that. That's Itmadullah's tomb, where I told you there are wine glasses and things. Of course, things have been settled over. This is what the relationship of all those pleasure gardens. So we mapped this where now the water is 2 feet, they've dammed it, it's full of filth. But that's what, we mapped the entire waterfront, because it has huge implications. If you restored all of this, this Agra, which doesn't even get one night of tourism, that's why Agra is, by the way, if you look at the economics of it, it's one of the poorest cities in the country. Because after the MC Mehta Supreme Court case, where because of the pollution, they shut down all the industry there, rightly so, to save the Taj, but it destroyed the economy overnight. So it's the poor. That's why when you go to the Taj, the touts all attack you, because there is no other source of income. So imagine if this was restored, people would spend days here, because it would be a completely different imagination of a city and a history of that elite. So this became a project. We actually went into the archives. We found names of the properties. Ebba Koch had done the initial work, but we did a more precise mapping of it through new technologies. That's what goes into the river. So we looked at all of that. And this is another book, if anyone's interested, which maps all this research and the photography, etc., to show what the riverfront could be. And the students then did projects that looked at visitor facilities, all sorts of other things to revive the river as a site for the economy. And this becomes a series, which is what I teach there. It's called Extreme Urbanism, where I take very wicked problems, and within that we can then distill theoretical ideas of it. And now we are on the 10th. One was in Afghanistan, and this is the whole collection. So this is one other collection within the urbanism. I'll just end now with architecture. I'm, I think, pushing it, so I'll try to go as fast as I can. This is what has happened in the country. I wrote a book about architecture since 1990. We have got more obsessed with the process of arrival, but not the destinations. So all the investments are going into airports and infrastructure, and our highways are getting better. And then through these incredibly snazzy pieces of infrastructure, we arrive at disasters. And architecture hasn't been paid any attention. And so this idea of this book was to look at what happened after we liberalized our economy to the architectural production. And we looked at what impatient capital was doing, which is half the city now when you see buildings that are built. We looked at local assertions, architects like Doshi and Raj Rewal and Charles Correa, who were trying to assert a flow that was global but making it more of the place. And then architects like Laurie Baker and others who began to look at what are questions of sustainability, what are other paradigms of practice. But then there was also faith-based architecture. Look at Akshardham. Akshardham and many of those faith-based pieces of architecture, much larger than anything else we see within the profession being produced. Even our campuses sometimes seem small. And so we broke the book down to looking at these forms of practice. And this is a book, we then extended it with Kaivan Mehta and Ranjit Hoskote into an exhibition which looked at the state of architecture. It was supported by many events, 90 events and discussions, again, to create a platform, to create this agency and voice about how we could look at architecture. We did infographics and many things. The one thing, a couple of things I want to point out to you here, I think what was a contribution as part of that research and discussion was this passing of the periods, which is independence, which is about experimentation, a brave new world. The emergency, which is a wake-up call for the nation. I mean, the emergency had its own problems, but if you look at the history of NGOs and civil societies, it coincides also with the emergency, because it was a wake-up call that India was ridden by caste, there was community disharmony, poverty. We hadn't solved any of the problems we aspired to at independence. And then 1919, the liberalization, which changed everything. The other thing that came out of this, what you see in the columns, the lines, are the schools, right? 4 or 5 schools and 428 schools at the end and today. And what you see in the blue, just above that line that is here, this is the growth and the formalization of real estate as a sector. And you see the growth of real estate as a sector in real terms of financial investment coincides actually with the growth of the schools. This is actually is problematic, and that's why schools are having a hard time. They can't find teachers, students can't get internship, etc. Because actually, as real estate gets formalized, the demand for architects is inversely proportional, not directly proportional. Because if you had Defense Colony, or you had places here, Koramangala, things like that, an architect was doing 3 houses. There were 300 architects probably getting jobs, 100, let's say. When a developer does a gated community, they have one in-house architect who's actually housing 4,000 people. So architects are not needed once real estate becomes a formalized sector. So it's inversely proportionate. And I think that was a great revelation for us, in the schools should really close down or reinvent themselves to engage with other models of architecture. And so this was we extended this into the state of housing, because again, what is in the public realm that architects do? And there what you see as these were 80 case studies we did of types from independence, where we actually mapped the process, how long it took, what are the agencies, what are the costs, what are the areas, what are the units. So it becomes a catalog for the 60 years of independence, 65, where you can actually look at what housing was, what is the ecology, where does the private and public sector meet. That is the zone of intervention that we need to expand. The 30 square meter unit, imaginary, what does that mean? And then extending that into architecture in the South Asia, this is the last thing I'll say, is it's been an interest for me since the end of the last century, where with Kenneth Frampton, I did this book which looked at 100 projects, canonical works in South Asia, where I got exposed to South Asia as another imaginary. Of course, these political boundaries are contemporary and culturally fake in a sense, and so it really excited me, and we then followed it up with another conference as part of the State of Architecture of India. We ended the conference with this, we ended the exhibition with a conference where we invited people from all over South Asia. And the project that you see in the exhibition here, which is the State of Architecture in South Asia, actually came out of this sort of process, and Devashri Shah and Pranav Thole, who were students at the GSD and then became colleagues, are co-curators of this exhibition. And it looks at all the countries in South Asia. All of them have been covered, and of course unevenly what we've managed to, and we're hoping this exhibition, the idea of this exhibition is it travels to these places, and when it goes to Karachi and Lahore, for example, we can locally get more contributions because we'll identify other architects. And the idea is, starting with 41 practices, our ambition is it'll become double or triple by the time it travels to all these places. So it's dynamic, and it accrues intelligence in a sense and research as it goes through. And it has many components, which are conferences, lectures. It's going to be digitized. We've done up to where you see the conferences. Now we are at the stage of the traveling exhibition, and then we'll convert it into a digital archive. And this is what, this is the gamut that you see in the exhibition. This is one of the conferences where we kind of even redefined the categories and called it repair and curation, and looked at other forms of practice outside the mainstream in a sense through those sorts of discussions. It is about reflecting on architecture. These are emergent practices. These are some of the kind of projects here which look at patronage, many other forms. As you can see, the practices are based in these sorts of cities from the hinterland we haven't yet, and that's why the exhibition will travel and pick up more sort of research as it goes on, as we map these sort of practices. But through this limited sample, what we've done is an infographic which looks at these young practices, 41 of them, to look at how many years they took to establish, what is the demography of their employee, how long after graduating, did they have a master's degree, what are the nature of projects they're doing, what is the forms of patronage they have, what are the areas that are not addressed, etc. And the broad conclusions for us were that they were non-traditional organizational structures, they were multidisciplinary collaborations, they were cross-subsidy financial models, and they were co-creations with communities in many cases, and they were really cross-disciplinary in many ways. So just to end, these are now the publications which I've begun to sort of put together to understand where and how one can understand this research and what is part of practice, what is reflection on practice. I'm just trying to evolve a format by which might be useful for other architects or for another generation to look at it. I did this as a big installation at the Venice Biennale, and the Biennale has now taken the whole archive, which they house as part of their ownership. And now what I'm trying to do is map what are the themes and what are the books that what themes came out of, and how one can understand where those overlaps are and how that can inform us. And so really it is about these modes of engagement. This I attribute to my friend Prem Chandavarkar, who first said this to me, is I think this is where we get agency, when we can calibrate the gap that is occurring between our spheres of concern and our spheres of influence. And I just want to say that I think it's critical for us to reflect, to create the basis to think more theoretically as frameworks for the profession going forward. I think that will give us more agency and a voice in society, which I think we desperately need. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Rahul. That was astounding. Just an incredible amount of just looking, observing, analyzing, and internalizing all kinds of things. And I think, I mean, you had given this incredible lecture a few, I think during COVID, it was online, and I think Ivan had moderated it. And it was a lecture that told us about the research that you've done, the teaching, and of course your practice. It's really, really unusual, at least for me, to come across someone who's doing all of these things at such an incredibly high level. So the first thing I wanted to know, Rahul, was, of course, you've done all of this teaching and writing, etc. I was wondering how this, if it does, in a way, manifest itself in your private practice, in the projects that you do in the office. What is, I mean, are you thinking about it now, or sort of reflecting on the sort of subliminal impact all of this research has about cities, about urbanism, that comes down to the way you pick your doorknobs or your light fixtures, or, you know, what's the impact on your private, you know, the way that you operate as a private architect?
No, thanks. That's No, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I would really say that, and, you know, especially for the younger people here, it's, you know, when I present it like this, it seems highly conscious in terms of things. But honestly, when one has been doing many of these, they've been intuitive. And, you know, friends here will attest to it. You know, I was never trained as a conservation architect. I jumped into this debate as an urban designer. And that's why I use the word instruments of advocacy, right? So I think, just to come to your question, for me, if I have to reflect back, and I think in working in Mumbai, I've written a little bit about this, I've not been obsessed with the consistency of imagery and aesthetics. I'd rather been obsessed a bit with the consistency of how one can connect some of these values and observations that one sees, into our projects. So, you know, we've done like what we all did as young architects, many of us continue to do it, is like, say, farmhouses, right? I'm acutely aware in those projects then about this sort of binary condition where elite from the city with very sophisticated aesthetics are going and implanting themselves in a rural landscape, and therefore how can you mitigate that? So whether it's about creating transparencies in the house that even a worker on the farm there can come in very easily, so the way you use courtyards, then those spatial kind of forms follow from that, right? So one has been acutely aware of it. We did a house where the living room was an entire canopy, which was an offering to the village, with a well and a tap that anyone could access, because we figured those people are not going to go there more than 6 weekends or 12 weekends in a year. The caretaker uses it with his family. And I think one had the confidence to do that through these observations. And again, some of it was intuitive. Now, that's why in working in Mumbai, I tried to reflect about some of that and try to make an intersectionality between some of the values that came out of these observations. And of course, sometimes, of course, it doesn't work, the contingency of pragmatism because of a client brief, etc. But we aspire. So I think what one has developed over the last 10 years is seeing how some of those values can resonate. And when I explain the work, if I did a talk on my projects, I've now, somebody pointed it out and I became very conscious. You never talk about this, you never talk about the detail of that. You're always talking about these issues because that's the carryover from the research.
Yeah, I think Bangalore is going to love you because we have close to 10,000 students, I think, in the schools of architecture.
Let them graduate, then you close the school.
So, no, I find it, I mean, you've been perhaps one of the most prolific writers and in a very interesting situation because you're at GSD as well as working here and some other parts of the world. And you're also looking at, especially through the architecture since the 90s, which is looking at your own colleagues and seniors as well as, the younger practices and seeing it as an outsider and also trying to practice yourself, which is very interesting. I think the research work, what I really enjoyed, like seeing what you've done is the possibility of leaving things unresolved and just investigated, and that there are questions about, especially when you talked about the Taj Mahal, which was a clear case where there is old mythologies, and these mythologies are not always ancient. They are also mythologies of modernity and modernism, which we have just presumed and grown up on. And how do you see that this kind of investigation can actually become part of colleges as a kind of investigation which can be done with students as well as, as a kind of a mechanism to generate ideas? Because here we struggle, because I think it's running on a model which is absolutely just pragmatic and trying to deal with how much has to be produced and made.
No, that's a really good question, and I've thought often about it. And so let's take, you said conservation like the Taj Mahal. Let's take conservation and, so I think I go back, and I don't want to use the word theory. That's why I said it's about reflecting on what's on the ground and making sense of it, right? I think we shouldn't carry the burden of theory, and theory is also not static. Theory also has to be reconstructed it's really what's happening on the ground and making sense of it, correct? So let's take conservation, for example. It's been largely driven by a kind of nostalgic. It's about a golden age we've lost and how we can reclaim it. We all fret about the bungalows of Bangalore and how they've gone, etc. Right? Now, if you reframe conservation as actually the big problem with the whole debate on conservation, I hope this helps you, but let me just go around the topic for a second. The whole problem with the debate about conservation is that it has jumped out of the gamut of planning. Right? I define conservation now. I mean, earlier I was on the ground trying to fight, save buildings, be nostalgic about it. I think conservation is an instrument of planning that helps any society modulate the rate of change. Yeah. So, for example, under Mao, the Cultural Revolution, China reinvented itself. Now they're slowing down, right? But the British haven't got over the fact that the sun has set on the British Empire. They are nostalgic about it, right? So you can't change a thing in England. English heritage is on your neck, etc. And we pick up those narratives and we pick up those aspects. I think we have to deal with change. Change is the only constant in our life. Now, how you create the illusion of continuity. So I'm not saying conservation is not important, but if you frame it in that way, way, actually it can be much more productive because then you start, and I believe what happened in the fort area with the reinvention of that Kala Ghor, that was inventing a new contemporary use and imagination without compromising the architecture of the buildings. You're also conserving it. So you then go into reuse and you go into, so it's a matter of constructing these narratives within which will come theoretical frameworks, which then for students become a way of operating. That's why for me, in the Taj Mahal, discovering that garden was just like a fantasy of Curzon. It opens up a whole different understanding of the monument and what you can do. By zooming out a little bit and seeing Agra as this paradise garden and these places, you can imagine a conservation strategy completely differently, right? And how you can reinvent them. And you know what's interesting, I was talking earlier to Ranveer, he was remembering it from a conversation, was those, actually today, Agra has one of the greatest plant nurseries in the country. A lot of plants get, because a lot of these plots, those families converted into nurseries because they couldn't do anything with it. So because they were essentially paradise gardens they were trying to create. And so it's very interesting. So then you can understand how you can enter a proposition for conservation where there's an intersection between economy and all of that, because it opens up more possibility. We get very narrow. And I think that theoretical expansion to happen in pedagogy would, I think, open up exciting avenues for students.
In that one slide that you'd shown with the planning, I mean, the urban design, the sort of plot divisions, and then the building. It kind of, I thought that maybe Whitefield was actually like the informal settlement, that it was buildings first and then the city sort of trying to figure out what to do with that. I remember going to dinner once long back with someone from Arup, and I was describing, you know, this is early 2000s, and I was telling her, completely sort of frazzled by this, saying, you know, there's parts of the city in Bangalore which are completely autonomous. They have their own electricity, they have their own, you know, sewage system. And she said, this is the future. You know, this is the way that cities are going to sort of, so tell us about that, you know, tell us about the way cities are growing and what, you know, you showed us that wonderful map also about the changing nature of governance during the Kumbh Mela. What are these models that our static city organizations aren't really sort of doing yet? Yeah. And how does that change? How do you think that's going to change? Yeah.
So let me, actually, I'm going to connect it to Sumitra's question because it also has a big implication on pedagogy. You know, I think, at least in my observation, what has happened in India, and I know, what's happened in India, and Prem, I remember for the Indian Institute of Architects, you had done that conference on urbanization many years ago where some of this was discussed. Actually, what has happened in India is we have focused, our major cities, 21 or so, have become black holes that have not only sucked financial capital, but also intellectual capital, right? So we are all trying to make these. For young people, yeah, I mean, of course, you'd like to be in Bangalore. It's more affordable. There are lovely pubs and things like that versus going to one of the towns I'm calling as a transitioning settlements, right? So I think schools of architecture, and I'll come to your question. Schools of architecture, for example, we shouldn't be going to Fatehpur Sikri and measuring it again and again and again and again, or to Badami and Hampi and all this kind of stuff. What we should be doing is setting up plants, right, could be like YMCAs, in these transitioning small towns that are not yet urban, where you're actually going to see the action. I tell you, students would go there, they'll find patronage, they might actually set up practices there, because their skills are needed the most and the contestations are the minimum. The contestations in Mumbai and in Bangalore are so high that unless you align with the biggest developer in town, you're not going to get anywhere, right? So I think these shifts. Also then there comes a shift in imagining housing and paradigm shifts in that. So I think it's a collective shift that has to happen. One is we've got to change our gaze from these black holes of the cities. The urban time bomb that India is sitting on are the transitioning settlements. The urban time bomb, these cities will find their way, they'll build underground, under the sea like Bombay and all of that, they'll do everything and they'll work somehow, right? There's too much capital at stake. The urban time bomb from perspective of public health, sanitation, is all these transitioning towns. And I think that's where we need to shift our gaze. And that's where if we begin to do that, Sumitra, to your question too, that's where the schools of architecture should be focused. That's where the solutions will come. And our agency as architects will get more credibility with that kind of engagement with real society.
Yeah, I think in when you were speaking about the Kala Ghoda festival, and which we have in the last few years, Bangalore has started a festival, and it's kind of reviving infrastructures which existed or have existed, and the government really didn't have a clue as to what to do with them or make sense of it. There were public spaces, there were gardens, and so slowly that's happening. But I think there is a wonderful space which is like a wedge, which is waiting to be, monetized or recovered for the city in different areas. So I think that's something which can be of quite a bit of interest, because you've looked at the Kumbh and the large things, and these small things could be good opportunities in some ways.
Correct, yeah. No, absolutely. And they're more localized, therefore you have a pulse of communities. And I think also for younger architects and planners, I think these are going to be the spaces. I believe that the most important form of, patronage is a tough word to use, but let's say the most potent support to transform the built environment and for younger people who want to do these things, I think it's going to come from civil society, right? You had many very successful attempts here under the patronage of previous chief ministers. It dies out because political patronage changes, etc. But civil society, I think that's the scale at which civil society can be most effective. Civil society can't be effective when you're looking at a regional plan. Yes, you can create feedback loops and things, but that needs forms of expertise, right? And if you think of, at least the way I would define civil society, is that part of society that has an empathy for the grassroots and for a locality, understands the street, the neighborhood, but it also has the wherewithal to negotiate more powerful forces, like the governments, the World Bank, etc. And I think, and that's one of the things I learned by looking at the 41 practices that we have there, that a bulk of them have by default aligned with civil society. And that has given them the traction to do what they're doing, albeit at small scales, right? And I think the spaces that you're talking about could be very important in transforming our cities qualitatively through civil society engagement and giving this platform and form of patronage or support, let's say, to younger practices in the next generation. I think for the generation of architects who are even 50 and below or 40 and below, I think align with civil society, understand what civil society means, and help in the formulation of those protocols for civil society, because that will be what could be really transformative. And I know with BATF here, I remember being part of some of those conversations, or at least understanding from Kalpana Kaur and others. I mean, though you all were at the threshold, whether it was bus stop, all the things that government has thrown off their radar. And now the government is even more ambitious in terms of scales of things they want to do. And so this is going to be what will fall out, and qualitatively that makes a big difference to our lives.
There was a wonderful, that's an incredible, we are seeing a lot of that in Bangalore particularly. Of course, the BIC itself is an example of that, that kind of, a force of civil society platform. Of course, MAP is another great example, and then Sabha that's just opened is also a similar thing. But we're also seeing, rather than this kind of patronage or the benevolence or the philanthropy of a large, maybe a very wealthy civil patron, we're also seeing practices where they're becoming the provocators in a way, that they're going out into community. There's a group called Sensing Local here in Bangalore that's working in Malleshwaram. There's Suchitra who's also working in Malleshwaram, and they're agents of the community, working in the community, making projects with the community, imagining things that could then fix. Right. One of the things that really struck me in your slideshow was also that image that you use often in your lectures of the Ganpati Bappa, the immersion of the idol. And for some reason now, of course, it reminded me of that movie that everybody's talking about now, All We Imagine Is Light, where there are these montages in the middle of the movie where, the physical form of the city is shown as silhouette, and at night with the voiceover of these women who are sort of fighting their fights and having their triumphs and their transgressions and all of that. And really the city, not so much in its physical form, but it is the myth of the city or the imagination of the city, this kind of intangible sort of aspect of the city. in the making of the city, how is all of these things, how are these things sort of manifesting themselves?
So I think the implication, well, I'll just give you a quick aside because, for me, I was actually writing at that time and I was saying the kinetic and the static city, and I was actually posing it as a binary because I was saying both these things. And there was a moment where Raghuveer Singh, who was a friend and the great photographer, he was doing his book on Bombay, and he came home one day for dinner and he said, I want to show you the dummy of Bombay, my new book. And he showed me the dummy, and on the cover of the book was the Ganesha motions. And that's when it struck me that if someone like that, through the lens of his imagination, wasn't using the silhouette of built form to express the city, there must be something. And he was talking to Naipaul a lot at that time, and Naipaul had just finished writing A Million Mutinies Now, where he was seeing a whole undercurrent occurring in our society and a tumulus kind of churning. And that made me think that seeing through Raghuveer's imagination and lens, another representation of the city. And I don't want to put it as a binary, that's why I use an image of the immersion with the buildings in the background. They work together, right? And so I think for us as urban designers, architects, we have to be mindful of those spectacles as being as important in the imaginary of the city and how it's important to people. It allows different groups to play themselves out in this temporality, because there's Tazia, there's Govinda, there's 101 of these spectacles that you can, that's what's mapped in the book. And how do we keep the spaces for make there? Can we make the spaces? That's the provocation.
Yeah, there was this, Rupali Gupte has this thing about thicknesses.
Yeah.
That when we draw our cities, we draw them in the way that, the building form, the sidewalk,
It's a
etc.
figure ground, yeah.
Yeah, it's a figure ground, but then there are these thicknesses of negotiation.
It's elastic. So the city is then an elastic condition. It can accommodate unimagined uses. That's what the Maidan is. We don't imagine those uses. Okay. The fact that they can do that, the Dabbawalas, they have taken a formal piece of infrastructure, which is the railways, and they've expanded to an unimagined use. And that's, I think, what we can learn. And I think from that one can theorize how one can have counter imaginations of space, I believe, anyway.
Yeah, it's nice to see what, when you talk about, these other how cities exist and the complexities, and which is very different from, whether it's the central vista or that kind of representation of architectural grandeur as a kind of projection, which obviously has political motives rather than, or aspirations rather than anything else. That this is far more rich and can actually make better, settle better with the societies in general.
I mean, just a quick response to that is actually interesting, because after we liberalized our economy, what I learned from doing that book was that the state was absolving itself the responsibility of making the built environment, right? They were focusing on infrastructure, of connections, not where you arrived, right? But in the last 4 or 5 years, the state has, in a very big way, come back into using architecture instrumentally, right? Now, we might agree or not agree. And so I think this becomes a question. So at that time, when I was trying to observe the city, it was from the context that if the state is absolving itself and all this is happening naturally, how do you make sense of it? Now, I think we are facing a completely different situation. And how do we reconcile this is going to be a challenge for us.
Rahul, maybe you want to take some questions.
Can we take a few questions?
3 questions.
Yes.
Make them very long questions.
Any questions in the house?
You can ask Sumitro and Bijoy also. Yeah.
I'm sorry, the question's for you.
Okay.
So I see a lot of rigor in the research that you've done, and in the later years, it's also because the research has been institutionalized in some sense with academia, working with colleagues, and etc. But I'm curious as to how this process began as you as an individual and how it got to this stage.
Very good question. Actually, a lot of it started with the studios that I was doing at the GSD. I would bring students here. We would take I called it extreme urbanism. This year I'm doing extreme urbanism 10. The Kumbh Mela was one, so there are about 12 such studios. And every time we came to Mumbai, we went to Agra, we partnered with a couple of local NGOs. And therefore, then I committed myself. I felt very uncomfortable being someone who had worked here and suddenly felt almost parasitic, that you're going and looking at a thing like a lab. And so I committed myself very consciously that whatever research we did, whatever the student projects were, we would compile it, we would raise the money, and we would give it as 200 copies to the NGO, Instruments of Advocacy, hoping that either in the schools of architecture they would be useful, or an NGO might use it to lobby with the government. So that is what actually was a self-imposed condition that allowed one to do much of that. And then I think the books on architecture began to take a similar tone. I started a lot of my research. I never taught till I started teaching in 2003. I didn't teach a day. But I was working with the Urban Design Research Institute, where we were creating many of what I was calling instruments of advocacy. So that one was doing, so that same spirit I continued with the other books.
But what about even before that? Before, when you were working on the Bombay books?
Correct, those are the ones that...
How did they start? How did that start?
That started because there was, and here Gunwanti, who's here, knows this intimately. There was the Bombay Environmental Action Group. There were many people, Cyrus Gazdar. But there were many, many people who were listing buildings. They were doing things. I got part of that debate when I was asked. I spent every weekend writing a note of 500 words because some building had to be saved. After a point, I thought, this is so non-productive. And walking around the fort area one day, I thought, with my urban design training, I said, it's ridiculous what these guys are doing, because unless you had an urban conservation, you can't write legislation. So you have to take areas. So that began to do the first book on the fort area. Then Sharda and I said, let's do something on Bombay that's broader. So it was all about, really, like I said, it was all about creating awareness. I wasn't seeing them as scholarly endeavors. I wasn't teaching, so I wasn't, well, not pandering is not the right word, but I was not conscious about the academy. I wasn't doing it for the academy. I was doing them as instruments of advocacy, literally to get that research out and put it in the public domain. Because I was finding people were sitting on their research and not sharing it. It wasn't helping anyone. And that was, I think, very useful in terms of creating awareness. And, young people started walking tours. There was more awareness. And it gave us a voice, right? Then you were seen as an expert. And when you're seen as an expert, you have agency, which means you can go to a government official and talk, and they'll take you seriously. So I think that really, and that's why I'm looking at all of this in retrospect and making these charts and seeing what is part of what family, how it connects, because I think it might be useful for another generation to see how you can position yourself in these things.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Senthil here.
Hey, Senthil.
Yeah. Mind-blowing to see the extent you have been touching. So as we discuss the architecture of transition, somewhere I feel, I think as a nation or throughout the world, we are experiencing something what is called the architecture of transplantation. So I'm bringing to the point that I happen to be in Oroville, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware of what has been happening as a city which has been growing for the last 50 years, not to a great extent, but there is a recent shift because of the political the motivation which has come in there, which is kind of is trying to establish a master plan which was prepared 50 years back, and then.
So what would your question be? I'm sorry, I'm only being mindful of time.
So I just want to have your take on such issues. If you're talking about, we talk about the transitional ideas, whereas in reality, a lot of things happens more as a transplantation or more a forced decision which comes into cities. Yeah. So how do you see as an urban
Well, first of all, Oroville is a very particular situation. I think from what I understand, I might be wrong, so no one be offended, it's grappling with its purpose, right? There was a very clear purpose. Then things happened, it became a crucible for innovation, many lovely things happened, people were sharing. Now, as it grows, they're becoming from adolescents, they're becoming adults. There are contestations where people are saying, well, you've got 4 acres and 1 house, and this guy doesn't have land because they have to have community sharing. There's all that. So they're trying to grapple with what that purpose would be. And from the little I know, because I know Doshi had worked with them a little bit, and Doshi suggested, look, natural systems, use that as your new meaning, but that conflicts with other things, so they're trying to now resolve. They have Weave Time or Dream Time. They have all these new initiatives. So I think they're just grappling with redefining their purpose. And every settlement at every stage, and that's a word I use, say, for why the Kala Ghoda Art Festival, that became the contemporary engine to drive the conservation of that area, right? So the Kumbh Mela has a singular purpose, and that's why it's so successful. There are no conflicts, right? That's why it works, because a refugee camp doesn't work because people have conflicts. They've had wars that has led to them being in refugee camps, right? So every city, every settlement has to have a sense of purpose. Now, in the contemporary world, it's never singular. The Kumbh Mela, it's ephemeral, it's singular. There are some cities that have a singular purpose, but our cities today have multiple aspirations and purpose. So good planning is about resolving those contestations. I think Auroville is a fragment. It's not as complicated as Bangalore, but they're going through the process from an idealistic, utopian, very well-meaning community to now resolving what the reality that's surrounding them. Okay, the last question.
Sir, so one of the things that you're talking about, as put forth, is that about propositional research. So there are ideas, there are concerns, and there are inquiries that one is taking out there and putting out there. So these concepts, so like how do we like sort of look at the other end of it, like in terms of testing and feedback, or let's say you're approaching, meaning part of it, like one can look at it from an academic.
Yeah, no, I got your. So I mean, I think what I'm suggesting is that, see, if you do what is conservative, what has been done, which has come out of another context and other contingencies, and you take that as a research project. For example, what Bijoy was saying, where instead of looking at them as thickness, these margins, you look at it as black and white, where, figure ground, etc., and then you test it. Your proposition to start with is wrong because the condition is different, right? And that's why I showed that map of India. I see the government maps of little dots, which are very clear, but when I look at the night lights in India, urbanization is a whole different thing. So that became a starting point for us as a proxy, that how do we, so the only way we could do it, and this is where my colleague Saurabh Bishwas was the expert, is we got data, we got the university to invest in data that goes down to the village level census data, and that hadn't been spatialized. So all we did was spatialize it. So those circles broke into fragments, and then you could understand these different layers, right? So then it's a proposition that we have to look at urbanization differently. Then from that can come the kind of theoretical propositions I was talking about, is that we have to reimagine housing. Housing has to be looked at completely different. It can't be the 1 BHK, 2 BHK, 3 BHK, which is ruining all our cities because it's assuming, nuclear families. How do we look at other forms of communities, co-housing? That's why we did the state of housing, to inquire into that. And so that state of housing led me to think urbanization needs to be looked at a macro level, right? So these are all interconnected, but they're through forming propositions, not saying, I'm going to research this, I'm going to do this feedback. Then that's a method you've taken from somewhere else, and the proposition itself is, it's not relevant for the moment, maybe.
So it's interesting to then also think about typology itself, because Bangalore is, of course, in a very unique situation where more than 50% is skilled migrant population. And so culturally, it may not be as cohesive, or it's as diverse as it can get. And like you mentioned about the shop house, because of the economic model, which is, it has a certain momentum, it needs certain floor plate size, it needs numbers of people and sizes of buildings, but typologies need to be rethought in that sense,
totally.
and development models.
Okay, so I absolutely, but I think what's important is that holy trinity that I talked about, which is mobility, dwelling, and livelihoods, and that relationship, right? So let's take the case of Medellin in Colombia, right? I mean, they had squatter settlements on the hills, which were really contested places, violence, etc. They had a train system in the valley, right? People took 3 hours to come there to go to jobs, all a disruption between livelihoods. All they did was put cable cars to the thing, that whole area transformed. I mean, it's a flourishing community with ATMs, there's no violence, people can get to their jobs. They saved that time because mobility has been, so if one of those components, so if the relationship between mobility, dwelling, and livelihoods, it's disrupted, the city falls apart. Or it privileges one part of the city, whether it's the rich or the poor. It could be both. Yeah, so that's, I think, where we have to go back to the fundamental before we even reimagine typology, for example.
Just one last comment. I just wanted to say, Rahul, that I first met you 30 years ago, almost.
You were doing your thesis.
When I was doing, not to date you, I mean, not to, yeah, not or me. But I sought you out in Bombay because you were already doing incredible things. You already had an incredible practice.
He was doing Banganga.
Yes, and I was doing Banganga, and Harshad asked me to come and see you. And I remember my first conversation with you, and you said, don't forget the connection to the sea. And when you're in the tank, you can lose that connection, and that drove my thesis. Years later, maybe few years later, I happened to be in Agra, and he met Sunitha somewhere, and oh, Bijoy is in Agra, and then he sends me this book, and it completely inverts the sense of what I was looking at. So it's incredible, Rahul, that over the course of my life as an architect, from being a student to practicing now, you have offered me this incredible series of inspirations through your books, through your essays, but also through your mentorship. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks to Rahul, Bijoy, and Shaumitra for today's talk.